Welcome to Cpp.chat, an irregular look at what's going on in the world of C++, chatting with guests from the community. But before we approve today's legacy, John has a disclaimer to read.
Thank you, Phil. To the full extent permissible by applicable law, Cpp.chat declaims all warranties, express or implied, including but not limited to implied warranties of merchantability and fitness for a particular purpose. Cpp.chat does not warrant that this site, information, content, materials, products, including software, or services included on or otherwise made available to you through this site, their servers, or electronic communications sent from Cpp.chat are free of viruses or other harmful components. So, with that cheerful warning, I want to welcome everybody here, and particularly I want to welcome Clare Macrae, who is our guest today. How are you, Clare?
Thank you very much. I'm very well indeed and really happy to be here. All
right. Before we get into why we have Clare on, do we have news that we want to talk about from around the C++ world?
I mean, there's a couple of bits to talk about. We mentioned very briefly last time, because it was breaking news, that the ACCU call for proposals had started, and that closes on the 25th of October. So by the time this comes out, you've probably got very little time to get your talk in. So you should get moving on that.
Okay.
I'm not sure if we mentioned before as well that CPPP have announced their dates. That's the Paris conference. It's going to be on June the 22nd to 23rd. Thank you for letting us know about that.
Okay. Very good. There is also, maybe we'll put this in the notes, there is on the ISO cpp.org in the wiki page, there's a tracking of all conferences keeping up, and I think it even tracks deadlines for submissions. I know you've spoken at ACCU, Phil. I assume you have as well, Clare?
No, I haven't. I've attended
in your backyard.
Yes. Yeah, I'm very new to conference speaking.
I see. Was CPPCon your first?
It was my third C++ one, but they've all been this year.
Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. So tell us about this. Which one did you start with?
I started at Phil's actually in February this year. As far as C++ is concerned, I did speak at a continuous delivery conference the year before, but Phil is probably a bit fed up of me thanking him for giving me the opportunity to get started, and I got bitten by the bug and enjoyed it so much.
As an organizer, I will say your ability to be tired of this is
definitely a success story.
That's right. That's right.
So then I got invited to speak at CPPP in Paris this summer, and then CPPCon was the third.
I see.
There are others planned now, but happy so far with 3 this year.
All right.
They got to the 25th of October to submit to ACCU.
Yeah, I plan to. And I'm really happy to say I'm going to be speaking at Meetings C++.
Oh, really? So I'll see you there, because I'll be there for that one as well.
Yeah, and I have you to thank for my topic as well.
Oh. Uh-oh.
I don't know if you know this. I was listening. It was very close to the Meeting C++ deadline. And I thought, I want to come up with a different topic. I don't know what. And then I was listening to a CPP chat, and you said something about, it's really strange that nobody speaks about Qt or Qt. And I thought, that's a good idea. So I'm going to be speaking about testing Qt code. So thank you.
No, that's great. I don't know why we don't break into the Qt market more, but Jens has a great deal of knowledge about Qt. I think he did some Qt, a lot of Qt stuff. So Meeting C++ is probably a good home for that. But I would love to see more of that at CPPCon as well. And by the way, I'll just just slip this in here and say that I really like that top you're wearing, Claire. I think it's just smashing looking. So you spoke. So you've had 3. Did you speak on the same topic for all of them? You spoke at CPPCon on approval testing.
Yeah. So those 3 were definitely evolutions. What I'm finding is I'm learning a lot from giving the talks and from the questions people ask.
Yeah.
So CPPCon was quite a we've improved the code as a result of feedback. So things that in the first talk said, well, it would be nice if there was a way to do this. Now there is, which makes the talk a lot easier. But the questions are getting, they're revealing things that I thought were obvious and so didn't explain. And then each next generation of talk takes up time explaining things that when you're close to a subject, maybe they're just a bit too obvious. So
this is something that we are constantly helping people with when they do their abstracts.
Yes.
They don't realize how much jargon, they don't realize how much is assumed by them because they're close to it. And they assume, well, if you're going to this talk, you obviously know what this means, and you obviously know what this means, and this is the interesting part. And that is not the case. The wonderful thing about the C++ community is we're very interested in all sorts of things. So you'll have people come to your talk who know almost nothing about what you're going to be talking about. And you really have to, that doesn't mean you have to keep everything at baby steps, but you have to be welcoming to people who don't know the jargon and don't understand the obvious things, right?
Yes.
That's something I'm particularly facing at the moment with a talk I'm doing, because it's sort of part two of 2 talks, really. So on the one hand, I have to assume that a lot of people have seen the first part, but then a lot of people haven't. So, how much of a summary of the previous talk do you give? And finding that balance can be hard. And again, I'm learning each time I give it, get a set of questions, and I feed that back into the next talk. So you're exactly right on that.
Right. One of the things that I discourage people from doing is when giving a talk at a conference that is kind of a follow-on to the previous one, don't say it's part 2, because a lot of people will assume they can't go. And you've really cut down your potential audience if the only people who can come are people who saw part 1. And very often you can, in fact, tailor it. So you say, well, here's what we're focusing on. If you want to know more about this part, you can see the earlier talk, but here's what we're going to focus on here. And then you give people the background you need to dive into that part of it. But it's tricky. It's always a trade-off of trying to keep the talk relevant to everyone, but also have enough depth to it that the people who are ready for that depth come away feeling like they didn't just hear a brief review of stuff they already knew. I want to say also, it's both gratitude and admiration, Claire, with the interview you did with Kevin. I just thought that came off so well. It was so compelling. I don't know if anyone came to the conference just because they heard that talk, that interview, but there might have been some, because when I heard that interview, I realized that your subject really meant something to you. It wasn't just, well, I had to think of something to talk about so that I could justify going to the conference. It wasn't like that. It's very clear that you feel, I don't want to say a mission necessarily, but you feel like it's something you really want to say. And that really came through in the interview, and I don't want to.
Wow. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that.
So what is it you wanted to say? Tell us about your talk.
So for the last couple of years, in my spare time, I've been working with someone called Llewellyn Falco, who is a real expert on helping teams test code better. Work better in lots of different ways, but the bit that I was interested in was the testing side of things. And at the point when I started working with him nearly 2 years ago now, I just answered a tweet where he was asking for help with C++ and the Google test framework. And I sort of very tentatively stuck my head above the parapet. I've just learned so much from him. I caught up with C++ as well, because I was really stuck on sort of pre-C++ 11, and then ended up as various types of management, product, kind of product owner and things like that. So it was fun to get back into the C++. But there were so many things that I had thought were difficult to impossible to test, and the approval tests framework which was created by Llewellyn Falco, just makes it possible to test code that people had written off as, oh, this is legacy code, we're never going to be able to get this under test, we're never going to be able to change it. And I'm just at the stage in my career where I've got a few years to go yet, but when I found there was something that if it was new to me and it was helpful to me, I figured it was going to be helpful to other people as well. So the application to speak at Phil's conference in February, C++ on C, was really a toe in the waters to see if there was any interest at all in people. Because I think Llewellyn's work is quite well known in Java and the C#.NET communities, but I hadn't heard it mentioned in C++. So, and the feedback suggests that, yes, it's a surprisingly easy approach to apply for a surprisingly small volume of code. And it still seems to be worth sharing.
So I think that the culture of C++ is not very centered around tests. And I think that that's different for languages that are of more recent vintage. Because I think that, and I know I've said this on this show before, but I remember Alex Stepanoff telling me when he submitted the STL proposal that there was actually an entire test suite to test what he had done. He said it never occurred to him to submit that, and nobody ever asked for it. And I think that's kind of our culture in C++, is that, you know, testing is, it's something we have to do, and it's less. I think we've won the minds of people. I think people know that it needs to be done and needs to be done better, but we haven't quite saturated the culture. People don't know how. It's not the first thing they think of when they sit down. Okay, I'm going to start doing something. You know, we don't do what the test-driven development that Phil has been talking about in his classes. It's just not second nature to us. And I don't think anybody's disagreeing and pushing back and saying, oh, we spend too much time doing testing as it is. I've never heard anybody say that, right? But it's how do we, what are the successful strategies, and how do we do it without spending all our time writing tests and not getting any feature work done? And that's kind of what approval testing lets us do, right? It's kind of a shortcut to existing code that wasn't written the way it should have been, which, you know, who's got code that was written the way it should have been, right? It's all code is, we wish it had been done better, right? But one definition of legacy code is code that doesn't have unit tests.
Yeah.
And what you've been working on, I think, with approval testing is to try to capture that code that doesn't have tests and put it under test. It's in some way.
Yeah, it's a way to get started in it. It may be, if your approval test runs sufficiently fast, it may be good enough for code that you're not going to change too often, to just stick with the approval tests approach, or depending on how you feel and how much further you need to go, it can be a step on the way to implementing smaller tests and adding mocks and things like that. So it's also very valuable if you're testing objects that have got large amounts of data that it's prohibitively time consuming to, you know, you can't yet divide something with 25 data members up into smaller classes, and to write asserts or requires or whatever your test framework uses for a large number of small bits of data can be very time consuming as well. So it's a means to an end that is actually also quite useful in a fair amount of new code as well. I'm going to try a slightly different approach to a talk that's coming up 21st of November, which is the Thursday. I'm going to be speaking at Phil's London C++ meetup. Is that the right name for it, Phil?
C++ London, yes.
C++ London. And I'm going to try a different approach. The talk there is going to be C++ testing tips and techniques, tips and tricks. So I'm just going to try and look for a broader range of, well, what things do people find hard, and what have I found through experience or found in books and things like that. So a variety of different ways to make testing easier rather than just focusing on legacy code and approval tests. That's an experiment, and it's a new talk, and it'll be interesting to see how that goes.
Well, one of the things you just mentioned earlier was whether or not you're, how do I say this? Whether or not this would give you enough coverage of something that you're going to not make a lot of changes to. But part of this is kind of circular, because if I have code that I don't have tests on, I'm kind of hesitant to make any changes, because it's like, let's just leave that alone. On the other hand, if I have a code that I know has good test coverage, I become fearless. Well, let's make this little change and see if it changes performance. And I don't have to worry about correctness, because the tests will catch that.
That's
Otherwise,
exactly right.
I'm terrified of that. I look at this and I say, well, this was done poorly. I could go in and rewrite that, but it's not a complete refactor. So there's going to be some difference in performance. And the question is, I don't mean performance, but in the way it in
Behavior?
in behavior, right? And so I don't know, is that behavior difference acceptable? Is that what was intended? And this is one of the things I've actually seen code that I look at it and it's clearly got a bug in it. It's not doing what it should be doing, but I don't know who wrote code around that, anticipating the bad behavior. And therefore, if I fix the bug, I've actually broken. I fixed the bug in this one thing, but I broke the overall, right? Because I don't have good test coverage. But I think that I think that your approach of just finding difficult things and surfacing those is going to be good for the discussion. Are you also going to make a submission to ACCU?
I will do, yes. Yeah, it's in my diary.
Okay.
It's a conference I love. I've attended it many times. It's the conference I've been to most times, and it's a wonderful, wonderful conference. So I'd love to be able to contribute to it. Now that I feel like I've got something to say, and with the support of others, I feel like I've acquired some confidence to say it as well. So yeah, I definitely will.
I think you now have a responsibility to say it.
Well, tell us a little bit more about this approval framework. What exactly is it?
It's, as I said, it's an approach that was created by Llewellyn Falco. I've tried to find out when, at least 10 years ago. And if you've seen it, I think the easiest way to describe it is to say it's based on an idea called Golden Master. And with Golden Master, you take your software, your pre-existing software, and you feed some input into it. So you have to make the minimum possible change to create some boundary so that you can just run the core code, feed in some data and get some result out, some file saved out by your new test. And really you're sort of casting that in stone. You're saying, for now, this is the output. I am going to assume that output is correct, and set up a mechanism so that I keep on being able to feed in the same input and get the same output. And that's what Golden Master is. And it's powerful, it's useful. And it turns out that lots of us in the C++ community have hand-rolled our own implementation of it and have found it to be fragile. If the output changes, it's really hard to inspect the differences and find out if they matter or not.
Right.
It's really hard if you intend the output to change. You tend to make a small edit to the source code of your program to say, just overwrite the output. And if you forget to revert that and you commit it, then your tests always pass forevermore because they're always overwriting the output. There's lots of limitations for that. And so what approval tests is an approach and a vocabulary, some really nice abstractions to represent the different stages of that process. So you've got an abstraction for naming the files so that you don't have to think of names for your output files, your Golden Masters. It's got an abstraction for writing the files out, so you can write out in different file formats. It's got an abstraction for comparing files. And then lastly, it's the most powerful thing is it's got an abstraction for when there are differences, comparing the expected file, if you like, with the actual file. And its defaults are set up so that it just behaves sensibly out of the box. So with the abstraction for comparing your expected with your actual, or received and approved is its vocabulary, its default is to look for one of about 10 or 15 commonly installed differencing tools. And so it pops up a differencing tool and says, on the left-hand side, this is what your current output looks like. On the right-hand side, this is what your expected output was. And if you like the change, you just use the diffing tool to copy from the new back to the approved, save it, commit it into version control. So you're not having to modify your source code to update the output. It becomes really convenient, really quick, really safe to use. And a lot of the challenge actually of talking about it is because there's so much power and flexibility built in that's useful in so many different scenarios. The challenge in talking about it is to say enough about how it works to give people a good conceptual understanding of when it's useful for them, but enough concrete examples of scenarios to use it in, because if you haven't been trying it out and using it in lots of different scenarios, it's really hard to appreciate just how powerful it is. So yeah, I don't know. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, and in the example you gave, you were talking about output in terms of some kind of text. But I was wondering about, many years ago, doing a lot of Mac GUI work, and I know that we had an automated test situation where what it would do is it would capture essentially, a screenshot and diff screenshots, and you had to be careful about things like, well, this is where the time appears. So we never care if that matches because we never expect it to match. That's never going to match. So we actually had to make kind of a template, a mask, if you will, of saying, we're looking at this, we don't care about this. So will the approval test framework already have some kind of graphic diffing kind of stuff that you could grab an image as your output and say, I want it to look kind of like this one, but not necessarily exactly like it?
That's a good question. Out of the box now, it doesn't have anything like that because we're really trying to minimize third-party dependencies. And
an image library would add that to it. Yeah. Right.
So it's basically C++11 or above, because the newer C++ we go to, the more we restrict how much people can use it on older code.
Right.
But actually, over Christmas last year, when I was working on my talk for C++ on C, and I was working in the Qt framework at that point, and I was working on rendering molecules in as spheres and polyhedra and things like that. I did need to use it, or I chose to try and get approval tests to work on Qt images, the Q image class. And I think I can, I was working for a company at the time and I'm not working for them now, so I can't use that code, but I think I can reproduce it and add. So my intention for meeting C++ is to add an approval tests for C++ and Qt, which is an extra separate repository that will have the Qt dependency and will allow that kind of testing. Everything I've seen about that, though, it's doing it via images is pretty much a last resort, because I found even I was getting different images, even depending on if I was remote desktopping into my work PC or sat in front of it, which all adds to the nice story that I was able to tell at C++ on C.
Right.
And for anyone who's listening and working in Qt, there is a commercial tool available called Squish, which is a fantastically powerful Qt GUI testing framework, and they provide nice alternatives to image snapshotting and things like that, where you're actually testing the behavior of the widgets. But so there are other options.
I presume there are some ML algorithms for diffing images that do it more than just like pixel by pixel, but actually analyze the image just to find similarities.
Yeah, somebody mentioned at Cpp.con that they'd done something like that, and they were using Python CV computer vision analysis specifically to say how similar are these screenshots, are they different enough? So I thought that was a really interesting thing to look into.
Yeah, that could be that could extend the time to run your tests, I would imagine. It doesn't sound like a it doesn't sound like a simple text diff. It's a long way from that.
Yeah.
So you did say that you'd got some good response. You've now presented this 3 times at different conferences. What is the what kind of responses are you getting in terms of both the frequency but also the range of kinds of responses?
Well, the questions have been really interesting. There's been some nice feedback where people have actually used it in practice. On the include Discord and the testing channel there, probably about once a fortnight of that order, I'll get a message and someone's atted me saying, oh, have a look at Claire's talk C++ on C. So it's gaining some traction. And there was a wonderful thing almost immediately after C++ on C, where someone on the C++ community watched the video. And what I haven't said is that approval tests is implemented for 15 or 20 other languages, and there's a really strong Python implementation. And so someone was able to, within a working day, take some Python code that was really valuable and didn't have any tests, and get it under test and being refactored, and the tests finding mistakes in the refactoring all within a day. So that was really exciting for me. Really nice. It's a shame you can't just look at the stats in GitHub and see the level of use, but a lot of the levels of use of it are in private companies and private source code. So there's
Sure.
When I did search recently in GitHub, it was all there's a number of refactoring katas, refactoring practice exercises that are just mainly set up by Emily Bache. They're really good exercises, and they by default use approval tests. And so when you search for uses, you find sort of 1,000 forks of one or a small number of refactoring. But I am confident it is being used in the real world in commercial environments, just in private code.
So Joshua in the chat is saying, is there any consideration on testing frameworks having this functionality built in, similar to how Jest, which is Facebook's Java testing framework, has snapshot testing built in? And he then says, never mind, found the documentation.
But the documentation is talking about integration with Catch and Google Test. So it's not quite built in, but the integration is there. So it is worth bringing that up.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
In fact, just picking up that from the Catch side, I think if anything, we'd like to move more the other way, splitting out functionality that's being bundled into test frameworks, making them a bit more modular, because not everyone wants the same set of features. And particularly something like Catch, which is a single header library, you don't want to be rebuilding all of that functionality you're not using every time.
Right.
So yes, I think if anything, making these things play nicely together, like we do with mock frameworks as well, but keep them separate and more modular.
Right. Or like possibly making an image testing as a module that would be added in, opt-in, instead of having it built in.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. Approval tests is released as a single header as well, and so we're really conscious about dependencies and compile time.
Yeah. But that's for the C++ world. In other words, this is already implemented in a number of different languages, and so there's different trade-offs in how those would be implemented.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So if I pull up the C#.net approval tests and just remind myself. So it's GitHub/approvals, and there's approval test.net, but then .net.asp, .net.winforms, .net.stateprinter, many different .net.hibernate, .net.wf, .entity framework. And so the people involved in the .NET side of things have, for many individual situations and extra third-party dependencies that are widely used, they've added small extra wrappers around the core approval test functionality. So I think I don't want to suggest that we'd get anywhere near that level of coverage in the short term with the C++ one, but we're very much driving it by when people ask for particular features. So when I was working, when I was employed and using approval tests, it was being driven by the features I needed, but now I'm listening to what other people are asking for. So we've had a couple of requests for integration with the Boost test framework, so that might be one that we might add soon. So to anyone who's listening and wants functionality and finds it isn't there, please do put in GitHub pull requests or contact either Llewellyn or I. Bonus points if you're available to help talk to us online and explain your use, because then we'll do a better job. But don't worry if that's not a possibility. But we respond to feedback, basically.
So you mentioned being employed in the past tense. Are you available now so that if I had some legacy application and I wanted to get it under test, that you could come and take a look at what we've got and could work with us on that?
Absolutely, and nothing would make me happier than to do that. Yeah. I had a very satisfying, very fulfilling job for more than 31 years in one company and loved it. And then in June this year, I realized that I was just enjoying learning about testing, catching up on C++, and helping people work with legacy code so much that it was time to take a leap into the unknown. So I've set up a company and sort of setting up in process of setting up training modules and things like that to help people out with this.
But you could work on, I mean, you would be willing to work on site, or not necessarily physically on site, but you could work on a specific project if we had that in mind.
Yeah.
Well, it's really too bad that there aren't lots and lots of legacy institutions out there that are under-tested, because I don't know where you're going to find anybody who's going to want to have you help out with that. Particularly given that doing that is kind of the first step to launching moving forward. Building on code that's well tested is I've been there. I've been in situations where the code doesn't have good tests, and you're just terrified of changing anything. And then I've also been in situations where you just feel like, it doesn't matter. If it's broken, I'll know immediately. I'll run the tests, I'll know immediately, and I'll know exactly what I'm trying to fix, because the tests are not only there, but they're of a granularity that if a test fails, I'm not saying, well, what do I do now? I broke something and who knows what that is. Instead, it will very clearly say, this failed, and you look and you say, oh, now I see why, because it never occurred to me anybody would want to do that. But now that I see, okay, yeah, it does seem to have a use case, and we'll have to fix that.
And once you've had that, once you've experienced that safety net that you can refactor with confidence, so refactor and find out if you accidentally broke something, or add a new feature and find out if you accidentally broke something. Once you've had that, it's actually really, really scary to be programming without it. But for people who haven't had that safety net, it's really hard to explain just how good it feels and just how valuable it is, both to developers and to management and leadership in companies and things like that. I completely agree with what you said.
It's a bit like when you first become an adult and you think back to all the things you did when you were a kid and think, how did I ever get away with that?
Yeah.
Well, I remember being, I spent many years as a contractor and looking at people's code repositories and being told, okay, this is the feature we want to add, and being just terrified of starting, because it's like, I don't know what this code is doing, and I can make the change that I think it needs to make, and I have no idea what I'm breaking when I do that. And knowing that, well, it's under test. If you break it, we'll know right away. And that's the thing. I can fix anything I've broken. That's not the issue. The issue is knowing that you've broken it and knowing it quickly. I remember, I've probably told this story before because it's so painful to me. At the end of, very close to the end of a development cycle for a major product that I was working on, and our development cycle was 18 months. It was a big deal. I was given this bug, and I looked at it, and I could figure out easily how to fix it. It's like, okay, I see what's going on. The obvious change is to change this code right here. But I knew this code right here is called from lots of places, and I'm scared to do it. So I punted the bug. It wasn't that serious. We could live with it, I felt. And I said, look, let's do this with the next release. And we shipped the product, blah, blah, blah. And the bug was assigned to me again the next time. But again, they didn't assign it to me early in the project. They assigned it to me late in the project. And it was like, the situation's unchanged. I don't want to change this late in the project. We are undertested. We don't have the kind of test coverage that makes me confident to change this. And you just live in a different world when if you test it, if you change it and you break it, you'll know. That's just delightful. I love that.
I sympathize with that a lot. I mentioned that I'd spoken at a continuous delivery conference last year. And in that, I talked about turning around the annual release process that I'd been involved in for desktop software. The title is Escaping 5 Decades of Monolithic Annual Releases, so it's quite easily Googleable. And it's really interesting how once you get into that stage when your release cycle is really long compared to your development cycle, how hard it is to get releases out and how hard it is to change around the culture of an organization once it's become the norm that releases are hard because we have to do lots of manual testing and we can't release more often. Then people want to shoehorn more features in at the last moment, just like you were talking about, and that quickly becomes this sort of continuing downward spiral where releases get harder and harder and harder. And it's really counterintuitive to think that the way to fix that is to release more often, because that's such a scary thing to do. But I was really lucky that I had a product manager who was supporting going from annual releases to releasing 4 times a year. And in that talk, I talk about the cultural changes involved and how we actually managed to get agreement for it. I mean, in some ways, it would have been nice to be able to do an update and say after a year of that, what else have we learned? But I guess for me, that's also part of the motivation about talking about testing, because we had pretty good test coverage for a lot of our lower level code, but by the time we got to some of the higher GUI levels and interactions between widgets across Qt widgets across large code bases, it became really, really hard to add tests for that. And having seen how hard it was to turn things around once we got in the process of it being too hard to test, then you're not just working with the code, you're having to work with cultural change within an organization as well. So I'm hoping that by sharing ideas to developers about testing, that it might help people make it. It's not just improving the lives of developers, it's improving the lives of users as well. If releases are more robust, features get out sooner, organizations can get feedback on features sooner. So I see that although the testing, maybe it feels like quite a localized part of development, I see it as having quite a broad reach. And so I really look forward in years to come to seeing feedback from people saying they've actually managed to turn around release cycles by improving testing along the way. That's my hope.
Right. I do feel like, you can talk about, which we do at CPPCon and C++ Now, we talk a lot about technical things, and we can do that without usually talking about process. But as soon as you start talking about testing, somehow process comes into it, because testing, your assumptions about testing imply certain things about process, whereas your assumptions about other technical things don't necessarily imply process assumptions. So,
since you brought up continuous delivery, I do find that can be subject to the local optimization problem, which is sort of the flip side to the cultural change you were talking about. So sort of springing the question on you a bit, but do you have any thoughts on that? So the local optimization problem is where you optimize your part of the overall system or project. So you're working really well. You can continuously deliver every day, a few times a day maybe, but nobody else in the organization can. And then suddenly everything else is a bottleneck. In fact, overall, the systems can start to work less optimally because you're working more optimally, unless you treat it as a more of a systemic change. It's one of the big problems that agile turnarounds often face. Have you encountered any of that at all?
Well, I just thinking.
It's a big one to spring on you.
No, it's a really interesting question. Certainly when you've got multiple teams working on different domain areas, different business areas, there can be a situation where one team maybe ends up with more of the responsibility for the release, actually getting the release out, and other teams are still carrying on working on new features, and that can set up kind of some tension between teams, I think. I think I think that I'd be happy with any kind of optimization in release processes. Generally, any kind of streamlining, in what I've seen, is beneficial. Part of the challenge, though, is you streamline the easy things, and then the things that are left are quite difficult, and then that requires commitment from the organization to spend some time to improve it. And it's really important that testing processes get run automatically and regularly as well. So particularly with Squish, the testing framework, it's really important if you have any kind of high level testing that you run it regularly, because if you wait until the release process to run the tests and you're releasing quarterly, then you've got 3 months of changes that have probably broken the testing framework. And that's not a recipe for happiness. So it is, I guess, not exactly answering your question, but it's really important after each release, after each increment, to try and work out what the hardest thing was and really try and make an effort to improve it along the way. Or the organization thinks, that's great, we've got this nailed, we can release N times a year. We're going to generate enough feature requests to fill N times a year, and not recognize that the stresses are building up along the way.
That's the problem. As long as you do take that holistic view and retrospectives and keeping track of what's actually happening and responding to that.
Yes.
So with the project I worked on once, we were effectively able to release every day. Everything was constantly being fully tested on our continuous integration server, but we'd actually only do releases once every 3 or 4 months because the rest of the organization just wasn't ready for it. But we knew that, so it was still worthwhile for us to be in a position to do that. But the rest of the organization never really caught up.
So one of the things you said, Claire, just now was that you talked about changes to the testing framework, or not changes to it, but changes that broke it. And I think that's one of the things that is kind of a frustration about test, is that when tests are broken, at least in my experience, most of the times tests were broken, it was the test that needed to be changed. And it wasn't really that the test was broken initially, it was that the requirements did in fact change. And so we changed and said, well, we've been doing it this way, but now we want this to do this. And we didn't think about, well, that means we have to rewrite all those tests because the tests are expecting the old behavior. And so it's still worthwhile to maintain those tests, but it is a frustration that, and it's part of the reason why people, ignore tests, or don't do it enough, because it's like, well, we've changed this. It's not a break in code. It's not the code that's broken. It's the test that's broken. And now we have to figure out what's the correct way to test with the new set of requirements. And that's a frustration. And I think part of that frustration comes from when we haven't done a good job of specifying exactly what the behavior we're expecting is. In other words, when we do unit tests, I don't see that as much, because generally speaking, it's not the unit we're changing. It's something having to do with integration at the higher level. We're saying, now this is what we expect to happen. So for the same input, we do want to see different output. And that's broken the higher level test, because the higher level test wasn't expressed in terms of requirements. It was just expressed in terms of, well, this is the result we expect to see.
Yeah, those are really good points. There's a lot to say to that. I think the number one thing I'd say is it's really important not to leave tests failing and red, that if the builds are rarely green, they just stop serving a purpose, because people don't notice the difference between 17 failing tests and 18 failing tests. So that's quite an important cultural thing, is to get agreement across all teams that to perhaps temporarily suppress a test that's failing if it genuinely can't be fixed now, but make sure there's an issue somewhere to come back and pick it up later on. That's really, really important. You very quickly lose the value of the time that was invested in tests. And then,
I once came across a series of tests that had been disabled, and I think it was unintentionally. I think it was done temporarily. And I contacted the person who turned them off and said, did you mean for these to all be turned off? And it's like, are those still turned off? It's like, no. Did you turn them on? How bad are we? And it's like, well, it looks like there's one test failing. It's like, oh God.
One of the beauties of Team City was the continuous integration system that I've had most experience of, and I'm sure it's true of the others as well. As you can chart over time the number of tests and the number of suppressed tests, disabled tests as well. And I really recommend keeping an eye on that regularly in the code that you're working on to spot situations like that. That kind of visual feedback was an unexpected benefit of having a commercial CI system.
Since you brought it up, John, in Catch or Catch 2, there are 2 tags that you can use, may fail and should fail, which are for exactly that purpose. So you can say, actually record the fact that this failed, but don't make it fail the overall test run. So it's still green, but it still records it. So you're not actually completely disabling it. You're just suppressing the failure.
Can you give us an example? What's the use case on that? What is that?
Well, exactly the case we were just talking about. There's something you can't fix right now, or you're not expecting it to work right now because there's some other feature you're waiting on down the line. But you still want to record that, and you want to know when that changes. So should fail will fail if it passes, whereas may fail will always pass, but it will actually tell you if it's still failing when you actually run it specifically.
So it allows you to write a test before knowing the code isn't in place yet. You're writing a test that you know is going to fail in the short term.
Yeah, or you can make some change, it's breaking this thing, but it's okay for now, as long as you fix it up later. Mm-hmm. But you're less likely to forget it because it's still recording the fact that something is failing, but it's not making the overall test run fail.
Mm-hmm.
Does it require somebody to look at the logs of the build, though, to detect that it's still generating the output?
Yes, it'll be in whatever report is being generated, but if you're only looking at the pass or failure, you won't see it.
Mm. But a developer running the test would be likely to spot it, I guess.
Oh yeah. Or even in the quiet output, it will say, all tests passed, 1 failed is expected, or something like that.
Can I come back quickly to John's scenario just now? The other thing I wanted to say is it's really important to treat tests as code that needs to be refactored, needs to be not repetitious, needs to be easy to maintain. So it can be tempting to rush on the test and do lots of copying and pasting and things like that. And then when the intended behavior of the code does change, it becomes much harder to efficiently update the test suite and spot intended changes from unintended changes. I think that's quite an important point as well.
If you've cloned a whole bunch of tests or cloned one test in a number of ways, and then you change one thing about the output, you have to change that in all those tests, and that becomes a maintenance burden.
Exactly.
Whereas if you'd thought about the tests in a different way, essentially inheriting the test or something like that, then you could have changed it at one place. And
any way that you could avoid copying and pasting, it's worthwhile.
Right.
Yeah.
So we don't have a lot of time left. I want to switch gears and pick on you in a different way. You said that you went last year to a continuous integration conference, which is a little bit different than what I'm used to running and what Phil's running, which is kind of language centric. So the continuous integration, I assume, was multi-language, multi-platform. How was that different as a conference than the experience you've had at language-specific conferences? Because I knew, I met you years ago at CPPCon and saw you at CPLs Now. So you've been, even if you weren't speaking, you've been going to language conferences for a long time. So how is this continuous integration conference different than a language conference?
Well, I have to admit that I felt quite a fraud going to a continuous delivery conference and talking about releasing 4 times a year and being excited about that, because most of the speakers were speaking about web technologies where you can, potentially release hundreds or thousands of times a day, and you're A/B testing and getting business data back and stuff like that. And I really didn't think that talking about desktop software and being excited about releasing 4 times a year was relevant. But someone came up after my talk and said they were working on mainframes. And so my talk spoke to them more than the web delivery one. So that was something. This particular conference, it's called the Pipeline Conference, and really sadly it doesn't exist anymore. But it was by far the most diverse conference I've ever been to. And they did things like all of their calls for all of their submissions were reviewed anonymously, and the only reason I submitted to them was because I knew that my submission was going to be reviewed anonymously, and that gave me the confidence to think that if I was accepted, it would be on the basis of the talk rather than, we need to improve the diversity figures and it's a woman. So I don't think I'm sure that's not the kind of approach that you were thinking of, but for me that made a huge difference. And their conference organizers specifically directly got in touch with a range of different people, sort of networked to try and get as wide a variety of applicants as possible. So that was really exciting to be within such a diverse group of people.
They definitely didn't have a pipeline problem.
So yeah, that was really fun. It was a one-day conference. It was in London, so it wasn't the same as traveling overseas for 5 days or something like that. But it was a really exciting thing to do, and I think I got 40 or 50 people in the audience, which made it feel worthwhile. My top tip, though, actually, which I'll share for any other budding speakers here, is I've heard many people say that if you're going to do a talk, you should record yourself, because everyone has their own little annoyances and things like that. And you really need to record a run through and see what you sound like and see what you look like and, try and get some confidence. If you do that in PowerPoint, don't make that the last thing you do before you go on stage, because PowerPoint will remember the timings and it will play back the exact timings of the slides by default that you did in your dry run. So here you are, a brand new speaker on stage being videoed for posterity, and there's this ghost in the machine advancing your slides for you.
Continuously delivering new slides.
Yeah, so make sure you turn off that option in PowerPoint if you practice your talk with PowerPoint's recording on your laptop beforehand.
Great tip. Well, speaking of speaking, as I said, you had attended conferences before you were a speaker. How is it different as a speaker? I mean, do you have a different point of view, or is it just the same thing except you get up for a little while and you speak?
That time in a conference between the start of the conference and when you speak, I think it affects different people differently. For me, it's hard for me to think about attending talks whilst I'm thinking about my own talk, however much I try and prepare in advance. So that I think that probably comes with practice and with more experience. So I was really grateful to CPPCon that I was on at the end of Monday. So by the end of the first day, my main talk was out of the way, and then I could enjoy going to other people's talks. So that's a different experience. But the other thing is, people start conversations with you and give you feedback and ask. You have conversations which help you improve the talk, but you're not just helping people whilst you're giving your talk. There are plenty of opportunities. I think I probably had a dozen conversations over the remaining 4 days where someone said something about my talk. Or asked a question, and so that was really exciting as well. So that meant it was a more interactive conference for me. It wasn't just up to me to start conversations with other people, which is mostly what it felt like at previous conferences.
So would you recommend speaking to people who go to conferences?
Yes, yeah. I think a lot of the value of going to conferences is the conversations you have with other people. I'm not the first person to say that, but I think what gave me the confidence to start speaking was to feel like I actually had a story to tell. And so if anyone is interested in speaking but doesn't know where to start, you don't have to be a world expert on anything. If you've got some small story to tell as a starting point to put a toe in the water, then I'm not the world's most outgoing person by any stretch of the imagination. I figure if I can do it, and there are lots of people in the C++ community, I'm sure on the CPP Slack, but definitely includes Discord, who are really keen to share expertise and support new speakers and give them feedback and things like that. So I would say give it a go. And if you aren't sure and you want someone to talk to, drop me a message and I'll help as best I can. I'll put you in touch with other people.
Well, that's yeah, no, I agree completely. I know that for myself, I remember a talk I gave at my company, and it was on some work that I was working on with a committee. And I looked around the room, and this is after I had been doing quite successfully some talks on C++ and things that I was really passionate about. But I looked around the room as I was giving this just short little talk, and I realized that everyone in the room, including me, was bored by what I was saying. And I just wasn't passionate about it. I mean, it was work I'd done, and yeah, but it wasn't C++, and I wasn't really excited about it. And I think that the key, at least for me, I mean, there may be people who really can make anything that they talk about sound exciting. But for me, if I'm not excited about it, I won't sound exciting. But if I am excited about it, I know how to make that come through. And I think that, so I know what you're talking about in terms of being also people coming up to you and being able to talk about what's going on and feel like you're initiating part of the conversation, and they also want to engage with what you've said, and so it's it brings something to the conference that as an attendee alone you will have missed out on. So it's kind of cool.
Some years ago, I went to I was speaking at the Stack Overflow Dev Days conference in London on iOS development, as it happens. And so the night before the conference, me and the other speakers had dinner with Joel Spolsky and Jeff Atwood. And one of the things that Jeff Atwood said, I think it was during this dinner, was the only difference between everyone in the audience and the speakers up on the stage is that you're actually out there. You've actually chosen to go up and give a talk. But that's really the only difference. So anyone can do it, but only the people that actually do it are the speakers. So I think you put it a little bit more eloquently than that, but it was something that stuck with me.
That's absolutely the case, that they're not necessarily the people who are most intelligent, not necessarily even the people who are most articulate, but they're the ones that made the commitment and said, I'm going to take the time. And it is a lot of time to do the research, to pull it together, to think about how to express it, and to put yourself out there. It's kind of scary to make these things and say, well, this is the best way to do this. And then to have somebody come up and say, well, actually, I think you've completely overlooked that, there's this case here. And if you did it this way, it's better. And yeah, you can look foolish, and you're putting yourself out there when you say this is a best practice. And then someone else can say, I question that. So it's scary, but the benefit of doing it, I think, is worth the risk. And it's, one of the things that I learned many years ago, even before I was speaking, I did some tutoring in college, and I realized that explaining things to people meant I understood them better than I thought I had already. I mean, I thought I already understood it. I took this class, I got an A in the class, I understand this. But when I explained it to other people, I realized there was a whole depth that I didn't quite get until I explained it. Connections, all sorts of ways of expressing it that you just don't get until you explain it to someone else.
Yeah, I definitely agree. The approach I'm taking is not this is the best way to do it, but here's a technique that you may not have heard before. And that's a lot safer, because the worst that happens is the best that you learn a new technique. Someone says, what about this other technique you didn't know about? Oh, that's really useful. Thank you very much. I'll include it in my next talk.
Yeah. Well, I think we're at the time, aren't we?
We are, yes. I had one closing thought, actually.
Oh, yes.
Just to dial it back round to approval testing. So one of the things that you've been trying to tell us, Claire, is that approval tests are really good for legacy code, but not just for legacy code. It turns out that approval tests are really good for testing test frameworks. And so one of the main ways that I test Catch is using approval tests, although it's my own homegrown Python scripts rather than the framework that you've written since. But yeah, I just want to put that out there as well.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Yes, very interesting. How do we watch the watchers, and how do we test the testers?
Exactly. It is the question I get asked.
That's right. Well, I want to thank all the listeners and thank all the watchers, and encourage you to join me in wishing everyone safe coding.
Safe coding.
Safe coding.